In our third video, we are looking at the rise of modern Japan. Objectives include being able to describe how Western intervention opened Japan up for trade. You should also be able to discuss the interaction that occurred between Japan and Western nations that gave birth to modern industrial society in Japan. Western powers had long wanted to access Japan as a trading partner. Japan traded, albeit in a very limited manner, with Dutch and Chinese merchants. Foreign ships began prowling the Japanese coast in increasing numbers, but were driven away. Western nations were convinced that the expansion of trade on a global basis would benefit all nations. The U.S. was the first foreign power to succeed with Japan. In the summer of 1853, an American fleet of 4 warships under Commander Matthew Perry arrived in Endo Bay, now Tokyo Bay. Perry brought with him a letter from U.S. President Millard Fillmore. Fillmore asked Japan for better treatment of sailors shipwrecked on the Japanese coast. He also requested the opening of foreign relations between the U.S. and Japan. About 6 months later, Perry returned with an even larger fleet of ships in order to get an answer from Japan. Japanese officials were split on the matter. Some thought increased contact with Western nations would hurt Japan. Others suggested that Japan try to compromise with America. It was ultimately decided by the guns of Commander Perry's ships. Under military pressure, Japan agreed to the Treaty of Kanagawa. The treaty provided for the return of American shipwrecked sailors and the opening of 2 ports to Western traders. The U.S. was also allowed to establish a consulate office in Japan. By 1858, more ports were open to the U.S., and similar treaties were signed with several European nations. The decision to open relations with the Western powers was highly unpopular in parts of Japan. Resistance was especially strong among samurai warriors in 2 southern territories. The Satcho Alliance, made up of samurais from the territories of Satsuma and Choshu, forced the shogun to promise to end relations with the West. The rebellious group soon showed their own weaknesses. Choshu troops fired on Western ships in a strait. The Westerners fired back and destroyed many Choshu fortifications. This incident convinced many Japanese people that their military had to be strengthened. It also caused the Satcho leaders to urge the shogun to take a stronger position against the foreigners. Ultimately, the Satcho leaders demanded that the shogun step down and return power to the emperor. It took an attack on the shogun's palace in Kyoto, and after a few weeks of fighting, the shogun's forces collapsed. The shogunate system was essentially over. Satcho leaders generally mistrusted the West, but they soon realized that Japan must change to survive. The new leaders embarked on a policy of reform that would transform Japan into a modern industrial nation. The symbol of the new era was the young emperor Matsuhito. He called his reign the Meiji, or Enlightened Rule. This period became known as the Meiji Restoration. In all actuality, Matsuhito was controlled by the Satcho samurai, just as earlier emperors were controlled by the shogunate. In recognition of the real source of political power, the capital was moved from Kyoto to Edo, which is now named Tokyo, the location of the new leaders. The Satsho needed to get rid of the old order. Doing so would only strengthen their power. The Satsho undercut the power of the daimyo, or local nobles, by stripping them of their titles and taking land away from them. As compensation, these nobles were given government bonds and made governors of the territories that were once under their direct control. These territories were now called prefectures. The Meiji wanted to create a modern system based on the political system of the West. During the next 20 years, the Meiji government undertook a careful study of the Western political systems. A commission under Ito Hirobumi traveled to Great Britain, France, Germany, and the United States in order to study their governments. As the process evolved, two main political factions appeared, the liberals and the progressives. The liberals wanted reform based on the democratic model with supreme authority resting with a legislative branch. The progressives wanted more power to be shared between a legislative and executive branch, but they wanted the executive branch to have more control. These factors fought for control during the 1870s and 1880s, with the progressives eventually winning. The Meiji Constitution was adopted in 1889 and modeled after that of Imperial Germany. Most authority was given to the executive branch. Externally, the government appeared modern and democratic, but behind the facade was a government that was still very authoritarian in practice. Power remained in the hands of the Satsho samurai, and the government system was set up so that they were able to keep their political influence and economic power. The Meiji focused on the military. They were well aware that Japan would need a modern military force to compete with Western powers. The new Imperial Army was based on compulsory military service. All Japanese men now served for 3 years. Education also changed. Meiji leaders realized that they needed universal education, including instruction in modern technology. After a few years of experimentation, the Japanese Education Ministry adopted the U.S. model of elementary schools, secondary schools, and universities. Foreign specialists were brought in to teach at the new schools. Japan also sent students abroad to study. Although inspired by the West, a great deal of emphasis was still placed on the virtues of loyalty to family and community. The lives of Japanese people were determined by their membership in a family, village, and a social class. However, it was also very hierarchical. Belonging to a social class determined a person's occupation and social relationships with others. Women were limited to what was known as the 3 obediences: child to father, wife to husband, and widow to son. Husbands could divorce their wives, but women could not divorce their husbands. Marriages were arranged, and the average marital age of females was 16 years old. Females did not share inheritance rights with males. Also, few women received any education outside of the family. The Meiji Restoration had a marked effect on the traditional social system in Japan. Special privileges for the aristocracy were abolished, and for the first time, women were allowed to seek an education. This was partially necessary as the Japanese economy shifted from being agricultural to industrial. Western fashion became very hip in elite circles, and the game of baseball was also imported from America. It is still a popular sport in Japan today. A new generation of modern boys and girls began to imitate the clothing styles, eating habits, hairstyles, and social practices of European and American young people. The social changes brought about by the Meiji Restoration also had an ugly side. Many commoners were ruthlessly exploited in the coal mines and textile mills. Workers labored for up to 20 hours a day and sometimes in extremely poor conditions. The Japanese also copied the West in regards to their approach to foreign affairs. Japan lacked resources. It was an island nation, so it had very little land that could be used for farming and living on, and it had a large population. For these reasons, Japan began to copy the West's practice of imperialism. After all, Western nations amassed wealth and power not only because of their democratic, economic, and educational systems, but also because of their colonies. Japanese territorial expansion began in 1874 when they took control of the Ryukyu Islands from China. 2 years later, Japan forced Korea to open their ports to Japanese trade. China had long controlled Korea, and the Chinese-Japanese rivalry resulted in Japan taking control of Port Arthur after destroying the Chinese fleet. There was a treaty that resulted in China giving control of Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula to Japan. War with Russia. The Russians wanted control of Korea, and they welcomed the idea of war with Russia. In 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian naval base at Port Arthur, which had been given back to Korea, but fell under the control of the Russians. The Russians were no match for the Japanese, a humiliating loss. The Russians also sent their Baltic fleet halfway across the world to East Asia, only to be defeated again by the new Japanese Navy off the coast of Japan. After the defeat, the Russians, who had control of the Liaodong Peninsula at this point, gave it back to Japan. Japan had become one of the great military powers, and it stunned the rest of the world. In 1905, the U.S. recognized Japan's role in Korea in exchange for their recognition of American authority over the Philippines. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea outright. Mutual suspicion between the countries was growing, however. The Japanese resented U.S. efforts to restrict Japanese immigration. Some Americans began to fear the rise of Japanese power in East Asia. In 1907, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt made a gentleman's agreement with Japan that essentially stopped Japanese immigration to the United States. Japanese authors began translating and imitating the imported models of literature from the West. The West also sought Japanese arts and crafts, porcelain, textiles, fans, folding screens, and woodblock prints. However, a national reaction had begun by the end of the 19th century. Japanese artists began to return to older traditional techniques. In 1889, the Tokyo School of Fine Arts was established to promote traditional Japanese art. Japanese artists searched for a new but truly Japanese means of expression. Some artists tried to bring together native and foreign techniques. Others returned to past artistic traditions for inspiration.